What we're witnessing right now is perhaps one of the most dangerous escalations in the Middle East since the fall of Saddam Hussein, and yet most Americans aren't being told the full story. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has just issued a stark warning about the very real possibility of a regional war erupting across the Middle East. And this isn't empty rhetoric. At the same time, the United States is quietly but massively reinforcing its military presence in the region. Aircraft carriers, additional fighter squadrons, thousands of troops, all positioning for what many military analysts are calling an inevitable confrontation. The question isn't whether tensions are rising, it's whether we've already passed the point of no return. What's driving this collision course? It's a complex web of strategic interests, Iran's nuclear program, which has advanced significantly despite sanctions, Israel's increasingly aggressive posture toward Iranian proxies in Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, and America's determination to maintain hegemonic control over global oil routes and regional power structures. Behind closed doors, intelligence agencies on both sides are gaming out scenarios that could spiral from limited strikes into a full-scale regional conflagration involving not just Iran and the US, but Israel, Saudi Arabia, and potentially even Russia and China through their strategic partnerships. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the American public deserves to understand what's really happening before it's too late. Now, to really understand what's unfolding here, we need to step back and look at the broader strategic picture, because this isn't simply about Iran making threats or the United States flexing its military muscle. This is about decades of accumulated tensions, failed diplomacy, and competing visions for what the Middle East should look like in the 21st century. And I have to say, when you examine the sequence of events that have led us to this particular moment, it becomes clear that we're dealing with something far more serious than the usual saber rattling that we've become accustomed to in this region. Let's start with Iran's position, because understanding Tehran's perspective is absolutely crucial if we're going to make sense of these warnings from the supreme leader. Iran sees itself as a civilization with thousands of years of history, a regional power that has legitimate security interests and concerns that have been systematically ignored or dismissed by the West for generations. From Tehran's point of view, they are surrounded by American military bases. If you look at a map, it's quite striking. To the east, you have Afghanistan, where until recently the United States maintained a massive military presence. To the west, you have Iraq, where American forces remain stationed despite the formal end of combat operations. To the south, across the Persian Gulf, you have enormous American military installations in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. The Fifth Fleet is permanently stationed in Bahrain. And then, of course, there's the question of American support for Israel, which Iran views as an existential threat to its own security and to its allies in the region. So when Ayatollah Khamenei issues warnings about regional war, he's not speaking from a position of aggression, at least not from his perspective. He's speaking from what he genuinely believes is a defensive posture. Iran has watched as the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2001, invaded Iraq in 2003, participated in the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya in 2011, and supported various opposition groups in Syria starting in 2011. From Tehran's vantage point, there's a clear pattern here of American intervention aimed at regime change in countries that Washington doesn't approve of, and Iran has every reason to believe that they're next on that list, particularly given the rhetoric that has come out of Washington over the years, especially during the Trump administration, when there was very serious discussion about military strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. Now, let's talk about this military build-up that the United States is currently undertaking, because the scale of it is really quite remarkable. We're not just talking about a few additional ships or a squadron of aircraft. We're talking about a comprehensive reinforcement of American military capabilities across the entire region. The Pentagon has deployed additional carrier strike groups to the waters around the Persian Gulf and the Eastern Mediterranean. These aren't just symbolic gestures. A carrier strike group represents an enormous concentration of military power. We're talking about a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier capable of launching dozens of sorties per day, accompanied by guided missile cruisers and destroyers equipped with advanced air defense system and Tomahawk cruise missiles that can strike targets hundreds of miles inland with tremendous precision. But it's not just naval forces. The United States has been quietly reinforcing its air power in the region as well. Additional squadrons of F-15 and F-16 fighters have been deployed to bases in the Gulf states. There are reports of B-52 strategic bombers being positioned within striking distance of Iran. These are nuclear-capable aircraft, though obviously they would be armed with conventional weapons in any potential conflict. The message that Washington is sending is unmistakable. They want Tehran to understand that the United States has the capability to launch devastating strikes against Iranian military infrastructure, nuclear facilities, and command and control centers at very short notice. And then there's the ground component. Thousands of additional American troops have been deployed to the region over the past several months. Now, the Pentagon characterizes these deployments as defensive in nature, meant to protect American personnel and facilities in countries like Iraq and Syria. But from Iran's perspective, these are offensive capabilities being moved into position. After all, the same troops that are described as defensive can very quickly transition to offensive operations if the order is given. We've seen this pattern before in the lead up to previous American military interventions in the region. What's particularly concerning about the current situation is the lack of diplomatic off-ramps. During previous periods of tension between the United States and Iran, there were at least channels of communication, back-channel discussions, mediation efforts by third parties like Oman or Switzerland. Right now, those channels appear to be either closed or operating at a very minimal level. The diplomatic relationship between Washington and Tehran is at one of its lowest points in decades. The nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was negotiated during the Obama administration, has essentially collapsed. The United States withdrew from the agreement under President Trump, reimposed sanctions, and added even more sanctions on top of those. Iran, in response, has gradually reduced its compliance with the agreement's restrictions on its nuclear program. And this brings us to what is perhaps the most explosive element of the current crisis, which is the question of Iran's nuclear program. Now, let me be very clear about something. As of the most recent assessments from American and international intelligence agencies, Iran does not currently possess a nuclear weapon. However, what the intelligence community is saying, and what has been reported in various authoritative outlets, is that Iran has accumulated enough enriched uranium and has advanced its enrichment capabilities to the point where, if they made the political decision to do so, they could produce enough weapons-grade material for a nuclear device in a matter of weeks or perhaps a few months. This is what the experts call breakout capacity. For the United States, and particularly for Israel, this represents an absolutely unacceptable situation. The Israeli government has made it clear repeatedly and consistently that they will not permit Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, and that if diplomatic means fail to prevent this, they are prepared to use military force. Israeli officials have stated this explicitly on numerous occasions. They've conducted military exercises simulating strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. They've acquired and deployed weapon systems specifically designed for this kind of mission, including bunker-busting bombs capable of penetrating the hardened underground facilities where Iran conducts much of its nuclear work. Now, here's where the situation becomes extremely dangerous. If Israel decides to launch military strikes against Iran's nuclear program, they would almost certainly need some level of American support, at minimum in terms of intelligence, refueling for their aircraft, and quite possibly direct military participation in the operation. Such strikes would not be simple or risk-free. Iran's nuclear facilities are dispersed across the country, some of them buried deep underground in mountains. It would require a sustained military campaign, not just a one-off strike, and Iran would absolutely retaliate. They've made this clear as well. The question is not whether Iran would respond to an attack, but how and where. This is where the regional dimension becomes so critical, and it's what makes Ayatollah Khamenei's warnings about regional war so credible. Iran has spent decades building up a network of allied militias, proxy forces, and partner organizations across the Middle East. In Lebanon, there's Hezbollah, which is far more than just a militia. It's a sophisticated military organization with an estimated arsenal of well over 100,000 rockets and missiles, many of them precision-guided and capable of striking any target in Israel. In Syria, Iran maintains military advisors and facilities, and they've helped organize local militias that are loyal to Tehran. In Iraq, there are numerous Shia militia groups that receive Iranian funding, training, and weapons. In Yemen, the Houthi movement, which controls much of the country, including the capital, has demonstrated its ability to strike targets in Saudi Arabia and to threaten shipping in the Red Sea with drones and missiles, capabilities that have almost certainly been enhanced with Iranian assistance. If a major conflict breaks out between the United States and Iran, or between Israel and Iran, all of these groups would likely become active participants in the fighting. Hezbollah could launch massive rocket barrages against Israeli cities. Iraqi militias could attack American bases and personnel in Iraq. The Houthis could intensify their attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure and international shipping. Iran itself could attempt to close or at least disrupt traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. Even a temporary closure or significant disruption of traffic through the strait would send oil prices skyrocketing, with immediate and severe consequences for the global economy. And here's something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough in the American media. Iran has capabilities that could strike American forces and facilities throughout the region. They possess ballistic missiles with ranges of well over 1,000 miles, missiles that are accurate enough to target specific buildings or installations. We saw a demonstration of this capability back in January of 2020 after the United States killed General Qasem Soleimani in a drone strike in Baghdad. Iran responded by launching ballistic missile strikes against the Al-Assad airbase in Iraq, which housed American troops. Those strikes were remarkably precise. Iranian missiles hit specific targets within the base, and while the American military initially said there were no casualties, it later emerged that more than 100 American service members had suffered traumatic brain injuries from the blasts. That was Iran sending a message. They were showing that they could strike American forces with precision, and they were demonstrating restraint by apparently aiming to avoid mass casualties. But in a full-scale war, there would be no such restraint. Now, we have to consider the economic dimensions of all of this, because a major war in the Middle East wouldn't just be a humanitarian catastrophe and a geopolitical earthquake. It would have immediate and profound effects on the global economy and therefore on the lives of ordinary Americans. As I mentioned, any serious disruption to oil flows from the Persian Gulf would send energy prices soaring. We're not talking about a modest increase. We could be looking at oil prices doubling or even tripling if the conflict is sustained and if it significantly affects production or transportation of oil and gas. That means much higher prices at the pump for American consumers. It means higher costs for businesses that depend on transportation. It means higher heating costs in the winter. It means inflationary pressure that ripples through the entire economy. But it goes beyond just oil. The Middle East is a critical region for global trade. Shipping routes that pass through the Suez Canal and around the Arabian Peninsula carry enormous volumes of goods between Asia, Europe, and the Americas. A major war would disrupt these trade flows. Insurance costs for ships transiting the region would skyrocket. Some shipping companies might choose to avoid the area entirely, forcing them to take much longer routes around Africa, which increases costs and delays. All of this gets passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices and reduced availability of goods. And then there's the question of what this would mean for America's position in the world more broadly. The United States is already stretched thin in terms of its global commitments. There's the ongoing situation in Ukraine, where the United States is providing substantial military and economic support. There's the growing strategic competition with China in the Indo-Pacific, which is supposed to be the primary focus of American defense planning. If the United States gets drawn into a major war with Iran, that would consume enormous military resources, enormous financial resources, and enormous political attention. It would necessarily mean that American capabilities and focus would be diverted from other regions and other priorities. There's also the very real possibility that other powers would take advantage of an American entanglement in the Middle East. If the United States is heavily committed to fighting Iran and dealing with the regional fallout, does that create opportunities for Russia or China to act more aggressively in their own neighborhoods? These are the kinds of strategic calculations that are surely being made in Moscow and Beijing right now. Let me also address something that I think is important for Americans to understand, which is that there is no easy military solution here. I know that in American political discourse and media coverage, there's sometimes a tendency to view military force as a quick fix for complicated problems, but the reality is that a war with Iran would be nothing like the invasions of Afghanistan or Iraq, and those conflicts, as we know, turned out to be far more difficult and costly than their advocates initially predicted. Iran is a large country with a population of roughly 85 million people. It has a substantial military, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of capabilities that are specifically designed to counter American military advantages. The Iranian military has spent decades studying how the United States fights and developing asymmetric strategies to exploit vulnerabilities. Iran can't match the United States in terms of conventional military power. They know that. So they've developed capabilities that are designed to make any conflict as costly and complicated as possible for the Americans. They have large numbers of relatively unsophisticated but still deadly anti-ship missiles that could be fired in swarms at American vessels. They have fast attack boats that could conduct suicide runs against larger ships in confined waters. They have cyber capabilities that could target American infrastructure and systems. They have special forces units that could attempt to strike American facilities in the region. And, as I've mentioned, they have this entire network of allied groups across multiple countries that could open up multiple fronts simultaneously, forcing the United States to spread its resources thin. An American military campaign against Iran would likely begin with air and missile strikes aimed at degrading Iranian military capabilities, taking out air defenses, command and control systems, missile sites, naval facilities, and potentially nuclear facilities. But then what? You can damage or destroy a lot of Iranian military infrastructure from the air, but you can't control Iranian behavior or force a change in the Iranian government simply through bombing. History shows us this again and again. The bombing campaigns against Germany in World War II didn't break German morale or force a surrender until ground forces had conquered the country. The air campaign against North Vietnam during the Vietnam War didn't force Hanoi to capitulate. The air campaigns in the former Yugoslavia in the 90s eventually contributed to diplomatic settlements, but only after prolonged efforts and in conjunction with other pressures. If the goal is not just to damage Iran's military, but to actually change the regime or fundamentally alter Iran's behavior, that would likely require something far more extensive, potentially including ground operations. And I think most serious military analysts would tell you that invading and occupying Iran would be an absolutely monumental undertaking that would make the Iraq War look simple by comparison. The terrain is much more difficult, the population is much larger, The national cohesion is much stronger. For all of the dissatisfaction that many Iranians feel toward their government, there's also a strong sense of Iranian nationalism, and foreign invasion tends to unite populations against external enemies, even if they have grievances against their own rulers. So we're left with this tremendously dangerous situation where both sides are locked into positions that seem increasingly difficult to walk back from. Iran feels that it must continue developing its nuclear program because it believes this is the only way to guarantee its security and deter American or Israeli attack. The United States and Israel feel that they cannot allow Iran to reach nuclear weapons capability because they believe this would fundamentally alter the regional balance of power in ways that threaten their interests and their allies. Both sides are building up military capabilities and positioning forces in ways that make conflict more likely, whether through miscalculation, accident, or deliberate decision. What makes this moment particularly precarious is that we're in a period of transition and uncertainty in the American political system. We're dealing with ongoing debates about American foreign policy, about the extent to which the United States should remain engaged in the Middle East versus pivoting to other priorities. Different factions within the American political establishment have very different views about how to handle Iran. Some advocate for maximum pressure, continued sanctions, and keeping military options on the table. Others argue for renewed diplomatic engagement and a return to some form of nuclear agreement. This lack of a clear, consistent American strategy creates ambiguity. And ambiguity in international relations can be dangerous because it can lead to miscalculation by adversaries who aren't sure where the red lines really are. Meanwhile, Iran is facing its own internal pressures and complexities. The Iranian economy has been severely damaged by years of sanctions. Inflation is high, unemployment is a serious problem, particularly among young people. There's been significant internal dissent and protest movements over the years, though the government has managed to maintain control through a combination of repression and concessions. The Iranian leadership has to balance its foreign policy objectives with domestic stability. A major war would impose enormous additional costs on the Iranian people, but the leadership may calculate that showing weakness or backing down in the face of American pressure would be even more dangerous to their own hold on power. So here we are watching this dangerous dance between Tehran and Washington, with neither side apparently willing or able to find a diplomatic path forward, and with military forces building up on both sides in ways that make conflict increasingly likely. The warnings from Iran's supreme leader should not be dismissed as mere bluster. These are serious statements from serious people about serious risks, and the American military buildup is not a bluff. These are real capabilities being moved into position, and the United States has demonstrated repeatedly over the past few decades that it is willing to use military force in the Middle East when it believes its interests require it. The question that should be keeping American policymakers awake at night, and frankly the question that should concern every American citizen, is whether we're stumbling toward a conflict that could have catastrophic consequences for the region and for American interests. A conflict that might start with limited objectives but could spiral out of control in ways that are very difficult to predict or manage.